Most heartfelt greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen. I eagerly welcome you back to Sturgeon's most premier station, Dusk Light Radio, hosted by yours truly, the ubiquitously erstwhile, unilaterally educated, and ultimately euphoric Everett J. Blackwell. Perhaps you know of us Blackwells. We ran the first non-profit mimic rescue and petting zoo. My uncle Balthazar Marmaduke Gaspar Williams Rosencrantz Blackwell IV was a remarkable herpetologist and something he called a mimication expert. He'd find these beautiful creatures abandoned in dungeons adventurers never went to and give them a new home, a new purpose, whilst educating the sturgeon-eyed masses on the importance of looking after both your mimic and yourself. These are dangerous creatures, you know. Strange, though. Most of the objects never reacted. For example, one was a beautiful mahogany desk that Uncle Dr. Blackwell insisted moved when provoked, but I think just had a few screws loose that made it wobble. Or there was the lampshade that he insisted talked to him on occasion and gave him some strange advice on makeup tips and contouring. Still, enough people went missing in the petting zoo that we knew one of the artifacts was a true mimic. Just wish we knew which one. Anyway, I'm Dusklight's main and most fabulous half-dead host. My job at this fine radio station is to bring you some of the most twisted, interesting, and downright bizarre tales that I and my wonderful many-legged runners collect from the far corners of Sturgeon and beyond. Some of them will make you laugh, some will make you cry, and some of you will look to take a trip to neighboring Dondella. Listeners, some of you may be hearing our transmissions for the very first time courtesy of the Dark Somnium, and if that's the case, you likely already know of Dondella and the incidents over there. I'm talking about the graves we dig. It's been all over the news. The Sturgeon Nexus commented on it the other night, talking about the antline of Sturgeon, targeting our most vulnerable members of society. I have it on good authority that our best detectives, not the nightmare ones yet at least, are on the case. You'll just have to keep updated here and with the Dark Somnium to find out if there'll be more. It's time for our next story from this evening. It comes to us from neighboring Menasha County and from longtime resident Damian Fitzroy, who says, "Dear Everett, this tale is over for us. Perhaps it will be of interest to your listeners." Zach Galligan from Gremlins 1 and 2 narrated it a while back, but we thought it may be time to give it new life. Also, don't trust puppets. All the best. Damien. Well, I never trust a puppet anyway. Too many strings attached. Sorry. This tale, his name was Mr. Promises, comes to us from the addled mind of resident janitor T.J. Lee, who lately has been around less and less in the office now I think about it. I believe he's started stealing the pipes from the walls and is arming some kind of macabre customized army for his own depraved amusement. Or for conquering. He also did all the voices in this tale. I always have to spend hours cleaning the crayon bits off my desk when he's done. Ugh. Special thanks must be given first to Mandy Mo for rendering yours truly in the beauteous image you see when you look at our page. And our music is provided with permission by Cryo Chamber, Invacto Elements, and the Dark Somnium, our sponsor for this channel, with gracious thanks. If you enjoy these intros and want to see more, please ensure you've got notifications on. Leave a comment for every video you encounter. With that, the sun has set and dusk has crawled into the studio once more. Whether you're working, prepping to sleep, or evading the formless void that will one day consume us all, Blackwell is here to soothe your ears and captivate your soul. Now, close your eyes and take a deep breath. The scene has been set and the light is on. It's time to walk towards it. I've always considered myself to be a good dad. Patient, understanding, a good communicator, and strict but fair. That's how I wanted to be with my own boy as he grew up. It's never that simple though, is it? You always have this image in your mind of how it'll be when you're idly thinking about fatherhood, or seriously thinking about it with your partner. But when it actually comes along and they aren't the picturesque baby that you envisioned, You realize the world you had in your head comes crashing down, and you're gonna fuck up on more than one occasion. Most dads don't sit at their sons' hospital beds praying for their recovery as a result of said fuck-ups, though. To explain how we got to this point, I have to take you back to my own childhood. I was around 10. My mom and dad had grounded me for TPing Mr. Watterson's house again and ordered me to clear out the attic. Finding things old and new to sell for a yard sale is a way of ensuring I would learn from my error in judgment. I still thought what I'd done was hilarious. Mr. Watterson was a dick, but it definitely taught me to resist the urge in future after saying goodbye to my Famicom. While clearing out some of the contents of my back heirlooms, I stumbled across one of those old Japanese dolls known as a bunraku. It was at least 100 years old, the paint smeared and cracked around the edges, the flesh-colored skin giving way to a more rotten wooden hue. My grandfather must have gotten it during his time in Japan during the war, because my dad had no patience for cultural knickknacks, and I knew my mom would hate this sort of thing after seeing Chucky. His name was Mr. Promises, and the tag attached to it, written in crude English, read, "A companion for all time. He will fulfill any promise you have with only one string attached." I looked down and saw that someone had affixed a pull string to him clearly long after he was finished. I rolled my eyes at the terrible pun and pulled the string. It extended out farther than I was expecting, before hitting the snag and reversing in slowly, a raspy but authoritative voice ringing out.
"Greetings! Have you a wish? Most fortunate. Mr. Promises shall carry it out. Simply speak the name of your ire, and pull the string for that fulfilled desire."
I shrugged, thought of how Mr. Watterson had seen me throwing the toilet paper over his house that night, and, in my 10-year-old brain, blamed him for me getting into trouble. So I pulled the string once more and said, "Mr. Bill Watterson." A sharp sound of a Japanese taiko drum being hit rang out, and the doll moved to assume a prayer position.
"With one swift motion, Mr. Promises has carried out your wish. Now you must fulfill my own. Pull the string again to finish this deal and begin to atone."
"Forget this," I scoffed, putting the doll back into the box I found it in and finishing my clean of the attic. After an hour or so, I went downstairs to tell my mom and dad I'd finished, but I didn't find them in the kitchen. Instead, I noticed our front door was ajar, and the two of them were standing in shock as blue flashing lights and several police cars and ambulances sat with engines running as the police took strategic positions behind their cars. They held fast at the front door, the curtains half drawn, blood spattering the edges. "Dad? What's going on?" I walked up and stood slightly back from the gap between them, the feeling of danger in the air. "Looks like Mr. Watterson has had an issue with his wife and the police were called." He shifted and looked at me, smiling. "I'm sure it'll be fine, buddy. Head up to your room." I was about to turn on my heel when Mr. Watterson's blood-covered sweater caught my eye as he stumbled into view, leaning against his doorframe with the blood of his wife coating his face, an almost trance-like state in his eyes as he shakily held a 12-gauge shotgun in his free hand. As he pulled the door open, he leaned against the doorframe and showed the twitching body of his wife laying in their hallway. "Mr. Watterson, please surrender yourself calmly. I will give you until the count of 5 to put your weapon down, or we will be forced to shoot." The officer in charge called back, unwavering authority in his voice as the men beside him held their guns steadily. Is it done?" His timid voice called back, the fear obvious even from this distance. "Is what done, Mr. Watterson?" the officer replied. No sooner had he done so, his deputy's screaming voice ran out as he shouted, "Don't!" Mr. Watterson stood for a moment, his body shaking from side to side before he nodded and in one swift motion raised the shotgun up to his lips, pulling the trigger and spraying brain matter across his doorframe in a sea of viscera and confetti, his body standing for a moment before slumping forward in a sickening thud. While the whole incident was burned into my brain despite my mom and dad turning to shield me too late, it wasn't the gore and the violence that scarred me. No, it was something far more intrinsic than that. It was the far-off look in Mr. Watterson's eyes and where they were directed that disturbed me. They were looking into my attic. Naturally, after I calmed down and composed myself, I tried to talk to my father about the doll I found in the attic, but he dismissed it immediately. Mr. Watterson had his issues and they got to him, Jacob. Nothing more. That was all I could get out of him before the issue became borderline taboo to discuss. My family would never speak of it again, and subsequently it was forgotten, relegated to a subject that we dared not to broach, lest the awkward silence fill the air and ruin any future gatherings. Time passes, the street moves on, and someone else fills the house the Wattersons once occupied. I get older and, as is tradition, move out as my life takes me to opportune places. I'd say it's been about 30 years since that summer afternoon, and it wasn't something I gave much thought to until I returned to my family home, a new generation in tow. My father had recently died, and my mother was now in palliative care, so it was up to me and my son to take over the house. I separated from my wife, and so this was seen as making the best of a bad situation by all parties involved. My son Isaac was initially unhappy to be moving across state and changing schools, but he warmed up to the idea when I promised him pizza every night for the first week we were there. He was a good kid, my spitting image right down to the freckles on his nose and precociousness. I began unpacking everything in the home and separating all of our things. I must admit that it was very hard to see my entire life in just a few moving boxes. The entirety of an irretrievable marriage carelessly thrown in with mismatched objects. I loved my wife Sadie, but her drinking was getting the better of her judgment, and after coming home from work to discover Isaac with a cut on his forehead caused by falling through the coffee table and a blackout drunk Sadie in the bedroom, I decided enough was enough. The proceedings didn't take long and I was awarded full custody. I promised her we'd visit if she went into a rehab center, and I left soon after. If Isaac felt anything, he didn't show it. But I did my best to communicate with him on a grown-up level, knowing full well that kids pick up on far more than we realize. Like any 7-year-old, though, his mind was easily fixated on the next important thing in his immediacy, and while on the way here it was making friends or liking his room, it rapidly shifted to picking out where he wanted to put his bed and toys. His energy was infectious, and I told him to go out and pick any room he wanted, hoping it may help him settle in easier. A few hours passed, and the unpacking was mostly done, but I hadn't heard anything from Isaac the entire time. Curious, I started scouring the house looking for him, wondering where he might be. I heard him laughing above me and felt a degree of unease as I could hear it coming from the attic. I turned down the hall and saw the hatch to it was wide open, an oversight on the cleaner's part, I imagine. Ascending the stairs, Isaac's voice rang out clearer, and what I was hearing made the hairs on my neck stand on end.
"So, what do I call you? My name is Isaac Fitzroy,"
he said with that ever-present enthusiasm. The sound of a cord being pulled cut through the air before a horribly familiar voice replied back.
Mr. Promises, have you a wish to be fulfilled?
It sounded exactly the same from my childhood, but was the phrase always that short? Before Isaac could reply, I reached the top of the steps and he turned to me, smiling. I tried to feign happiness, forcing the edges of my smile to curl up in spite of my fear. "Hey, bud, who are you talking to?" I asked, knowing full well the response I was about to receive.
"He's called Mr. Promises. Is this one of your toys, Dad?"
He beamed at me, clutching the ever-disturbing Bunraku doll tightly in his hand. I shook my head, the request that he leave it there about to leave my mouth when he interjected,
"Can I keep him? He seems really cool."
You have to understand, my incident was a long time ago, to the point where in that moment I was, as an adult, willing to do what most of us would do when we're confronted with uncomfortable truths, push it to the back of my mind and lie to myself. So, when my son, who had just left his old life and mom behind, wanted a keepsake to make him happy, well, who was I to refuse? I nodded and told him if he helped me with the last of the unpacking, he could keep him. He was overjoyed and agreed. The next few days were relatively peaceful. We got on with our lives, and it seemed Isaac was adjusting well. I'd occasionally catch him talking to the doll as if it were an imaginary friend, but the conversations always seemed to fall within the realms of what a kid usually talked about when playing, so I didn't think much of it. I'll admit, when hearing Mr. Promise's voice lines in response, it was almost comical. Isaac needed the confidence boost, and if that was found within a creepy doll from my childhood, well, that'd be fine by me. His happiness was most important. Over time, though, I began to observe small changes in him. Things that at first didn't fall out of the ordinary spectrum of misbehavior, breaking a toy in a fit of anger or throwing a tantrum because something didn't go his way. And in those cases, I'd just sit him down and talk to him about how he felt, which ended with a hug and an apology most times. But then things escalated. He would punch holes in the drywall, break his furniture, and even throw rocks at stray animals. Every time I confronted him about it, he would tell me that Mr. Promises told him to do it, and that it was part of his secret game. When I pressed him for more information, he would look up to his room where Mr. Promises resided, look back to me, and shake his head slowly and intentionally. This frustrated me, of course, but as a single parent trying to adjust to a new life, all I felt I could do was talk to him and try to take away anything he loved for a short period of time as a temporary punishment. Last week, however, two things happened that would change the very course of our lives. First, in a completely out-of-the-blue attack, he bit the babysitter while I was at work and did enough damage that she had to be sent to the hospital. I was furious when I got the news and took him straight from our neighbors to our living room to scold him. But even my anger couldn't match his. He was kicking the walls openly, trying to throw anything he could get his hands on. It took his eyes darting towards the top of the stairs for him to completely fall inert, his entire demeanor shifting and becoming that of a timid boy once again.
I lost the game. He's gonna be so mad at me, Dad. I'm sorry. Please don't punish me.
He begged. I was confused, but eager to help him no matter the cost or the stress. I'm not gonna punish you harshly, Isaac, but you have to apologize to the babysitter, okay? And what game are you playing? I held his shoulders and made sure I looked him in the eye when I asked, fearing someone was putting pressure on him to misbehave without my realizing it.
I'll tell her I'm sorry, but I'm not being punished by you, he replied, his voice shaking. I'm being punished by Mr. Promises. I can't tell you about the game. I'll get into more trouble.
Alarm bells now ringing, I sat on the floor and ran my hand through his hair to placate him, promising him he would be safe with me if he trusted me. You do trust me, right, bud? I asked, hoping that things weren't any worse than what I already feared. It took a moment, but sheepishly he put a small note in my hands before looking back at the floor. The words, "The Road to Promises," written in crude black crayon on the front. Sensing his shame, I decided not to make him stand there while I read the note. Go get ready for bed, buddy. I'll come tuck you in. Everything will be okay. I promise. He nodded, walking off to the stairs and repeatedly saying I'm sorry under his breath. When he was out of view, I opened the note and felt the bile rise in my throat at every sentence. The Road to Promises.
Mr. Promises is doing this for your own good. Follow these instructions like any good boy should. Every 12 hours there will be a new challenge, and for every challenge that you succeed, I will bring you closer to what you need. For every challenge you fail, a punishment you will entail. The game starts now, but do not fret. All pain is temporary. Yours hasn't happened yet. Your finest possession you must break, for we truly know when our hearts begin to ache. When the penultimate game is done, pass this to the Father, with love from the Son. Mr. Promises will be waiting. Elder Fitzroy, will you be participating?
My hands shook as I gripped the letter, but I decided acting now would be too much for him, and that it was better to deal with it in the morning. I sat with him and read his favorite stories until he finally fell asleep, still occasionally telling me he was sorry under his breath. As I left, I saw Mr. Promises sitting on his shelf, looking down and across the room at the sleeping Isaac. Disgust filled me, and I took him quietly from Isaac's room and put him back in the attic for the night, electing to tell Isaac that he'd gone missing. Everything in me was screaming to keep him away from my son, and until I understood what he was, at least I could put him far away from his prying hands. Settling in for bed that night, I had no idea the mistake I'd made. It was a few hours later when I woke to the sound of a soft scraping coming from somewhere in the house. Being a parent and coupled with recent events, my mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario, and I leapt out of bed and listened intently for the sound again. It was coming from below me. I followed it down towards the kitchen, and the sounds became more intense, the scraping accompanied by whimpering. Turning the corner, I was greeted with the horrifying sight of my son running a blade across the back of a stray cat. The blood dripped from multiple deep lacerations and coated the white floor in a vivid crimson. If the cat was alive when Isaac started cutting it, it clearly wasn't now. The limp and emaciated creature sprawled out on the floor as Isaac dutifully carved segments off of it with the carving knife, his face transfixed and eyes almost hollow as he continued. Isaac, what the hell are you doing? I tried to contain myself, but urgency and shock overcame me as my voice began to rise. His arms stopped as he was bringing the knife down again, and he remained still. The entire atmosphere was tense. He was just a boy, but I knew I had to be careful with how I approached this, especially when he had a weapon. There was something else I couldn't shake, there in the dead of night. I felt like I had to be on guard, not just from my son, but from something else. Isaac, look at me, son. I need you to listen. I began, crouching down to his level but keeping a safe distance, my voice lowering back to a calm state. We can talk about this, and I promise you that I won't get mad, but you have to put the knife down, okay? I took a small shuffle forward and I heard the smallest of cracks. Isaac's fingers shot up from his free hand and pointed towards me, wagging in place as if to ward me away. Was my son in a trance? He had never shown this kind of behavior before, save for the occasional nightmare. Isaac, is someone putting you up to this? Are they here with you? I asked softly, another step forward and focused on keeping the atmosphere calm. He was sat near the center of the kitchen and I wasn't able to spot what was behind the island. When he nodded though, I stopped moving and felt my muscles tighten. My cell was upstairs and I had no weapons on me. The alarm hadn't gone off and there was no signs of a break-in. It was... he started, but a gruff voice rang out from behind him.
Young Fitzroy, that would be most unadvisable. Our game is not yet done. Speak out now, and Mr. Promises will hold you liable. Remember, you have not yet won.
Isaac fell silent again and tears began to run down his face, smearing the floor and causing ripples in the blood as it made contact. My blood ran cold and the feeling of danger mounted with every second I kept my son near that godforsaken doll. Where is he, Isaac? Another step. I'm within arm's reach now. Where is Mr. Promises? Isaac shook his head, whimpering and muttering, "No, I can't," under his breath with more and more panic, each time his voice cracking a little more. It's okay, buddy. We will get through this, I promise. I began to reach out slowly for the knife when a sick laugh emanated from behind the counter, the sound of the cord reverting.
Now!
The voice bellowed as Isaac lunged forward and drove the knife into my shoulder. Pain erupted through my body as my vision began to blur and the sight of my only son's anguish-ridden face inches from mine intermixed as he pushed me to the ground, pinning the knife into me before running toward the door. Upside down, I could still see his blurred visage as he pulled the door to a close and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Dad," before letting it shut.
Long have I waited, patiently with breath so bated. Elder Fitzroy, you made a promise, it's true. Now...
I heard the clicking and scraping of wood as something began lumbering from behind the counter, out of my vision and towards me. First one hand gripped my leg and then the other pulled itself up my torso, the clicking getting louder as it reached my neck. A pair of spindly hands pulling on my chin before a twisted, demonic face glared down at me. Gone were the features of a human Baraku doll, instead replaced with pale skin, yellow piercing eyes, and an unhinged jaw filled with at least 3 rows of small black teeth.
Now you must fulfill your promise before the night is through. Your son's final challenge, that is already due.
Its jaw crunched and clicked horrifically as it threatened to get closer, the raspy laughter filling the kitchen. The pain in my chest was nothing compared to the sheer terror running through my mind in that moment. Out of fear and stupidity, I swatted the puppet away with everything I had, pulling the knife from my shoulder and rushing towards the door, slamming it shut behind me. The instinctual fear of a parent overcame me. I ran straight to Isaac's room and saw the door was shut and not budging. I knocked frantically for Isaac to open up, but there was no reply. Every eventual horrific outcome filled my mind as the cackling from downstairs continued. I looked around for something tangible to help me bust the door open when my eyes fell on the bathroom door. It was ajar. Oh no. No. I began, my anxiety building as I rushed to confirm my worst suspicions. The medicine cabinet had been raided. I took a couple of steps back and rammed my body into the door with full force. It barely budged on the first occasion, my shoulder rushing with pain. No matter. Try again. I reared back and through gritted teeth pushed again, the door giving way as I stumbled through. In the corner lay my boy, a half-empty bottle of pills on his side and his body twitching. I called the ambulance in a haze and watched as they took him away, not even having the energy to ask to sit in the ambulance with him. I feel like I'd failed him completely as a father. A neighbor drove me to the hospital where I sat, waiting to be let in to see my boy. I decided to use that time to call our family and let them know what happened. While my wife didn't pick up, my mother did. The moment I heard her voice, I felt the walls coming down. Everything I'd bottled up rushed to the surface as the fear of what was going on in and out of my control overwhelmed me. Mom, Isaac isn't doing so well, I began, trying to keep my composure. He's taken a bunch of pills and, well, he's not been alright for a couple weeks. I'm not sure why.
Honey, I'm sure you're doing your best with him. Adjustments can be tough, and it was hard on you too back then.
She soothed, trying her best to be comforting from a distance.
You were never the same after Danny died.
Danny? Who's Danny, Mom? I asked, hoping she wasn't about to slip to a forgetful patch. I knew she couldn't help it, but I needed my mom at that moment. There was a pause before she replied.
Danny Watterson, your best friend? You used to see him every day until that summer afternoon when Bill did what he did. We should have never let you over his house. Your father blamed himself for that until his dying day, you know.
My stomach contracted and my hand shook as I held the phone to my ear. Ma, I was at home when that happened. I stood behind you and Dad when it all went down because I was cleaning out the attic, remember? I TP'd Mr. Watterson's house because...
No, honey. You were at theirs because he told us you could help clean the house as punishment. Danny did it as a prank, and you offered to help your best friend. You were in the house that day when Bill...
I felt sick. I began to remember things I'd long blocked out. Danny showing me the doll from his attic. Him wishing his dad was dead so he wouldn't put his hands on him again. The ensuing violence while I hid upstairs and clutched Mr. Promises. And then I recalled the moment I heard the gunshots. The visceral shriek from Danny's mom as she was blasted point blank in the face, her brain matter splattering across the walls. The sounds Danny made as he was dragged from the top of the stairs near the attic entrance to his room. A pillow placed over him and a muffled gunshot rang out. A manic voice ringing out as he called for me, blood-covered shotgun in hand, while I sat motionless in his attic. I remembered Mr. Promises being next to me. I remembered pulling the cord and wishing to survive beyond anything else. Mr. Promises clapped his hands together, and in that moment I forgot ever being in that house. I forgot Danny, and I continued my life as normal. But I never fulfilled my end of the bargain. Mom, I gotta go. I'll call you as soon as I know more. Okay? Thank you. My throat was dry and I felt my vision blurring from the stress. I put the phone down before I could even hear her reply and sought out the doctor. Is he safe? Is my boy safe?
I asked, panic riddling my voice as I controlled every impulse not to rush into the room he was being attended to. You're lucky you got him here when you did, Mr. Fitzroy. Any more pills or any longer, and this may have turned out differently. His kind eyes put me at ease, but I knew something worse was waiting for me. He's not ready for visitors right now. I would go home if I were you, and we can call you when he's ready. I took both of his hands in mine, tears of relief and of fear filling up as I thanked him profusely. The moment he's awake, or if anything happens, I began, my voice breaking. We will call you, yes, he smiled back. I left the hospital, not knowing if it was the last time I would see my son or not, but knowing that the saying of old rang truer in that moment than it ever had before. The sins of the father often do haunt the son. The house was a totally different entity when I returned. The safety of it as a child and as a parent was totally gone. Windows felt like soulless black eyes, the door still slightly ajar like an inviting mouth, and every step I took felt like it was simply prey waiting to be devoured by what horror lurked in my own home. Was Sturgeon always like this? The lights were off and I could see my own dried blood in the hall, a handprint on the stairway and a trail leading from the kitchen, the door now open. It felt wrong to even be here, but I knew that this had to be done. My son's life was more important than my selfish fears and desires to avoid the responsibility I set out all those years ago. Mr. Promises, I will fulfill my end of the bargain, I called out, still somehow feeling ridiculous talking to a goddamn puppet. But after everything I'd seen, it was a small price to pay.
The Elder Fitzroy has returned. Fulfill his promise, lest a liar get burned.
He jeered, his voice echoing around the house and bouncing off every corner.
30 years late, this fulfillment will be. What will you do if that is not enough for me?
I paused. I had no idea what he would even want in return. I didn't know if this would be a fair trade or not. Danny wished for his dad to never lay hands on him again. Though he got his wish, it came at the cost of his life. Would my wish ultimately have that end too? What did my son ask you for? I called out, Mr. Promises giggling.
He wanted his family to be closer, more secure, so I presented him with a route to ensure that forevermore.
I saw a figure move frantically in the corner of my eye.
In death, your grief would rekindle your love. Your son could indulge too, looking on from above.
It seemed no matter what way I looked at it, this was not a simple trade-off. Something had to give. But as I said, I consider myself a good parent, and that means sacrifice is necessary, right? Whatever it takes, I will fulfill my promise, I replied, standing firm but internally shaking, terrified of what my life would be without my son.
Consider it done, Elder Fitzroy. But if I were you, I'd keep an eye on your boy.
He was right behind me. His voice sounded so real. I could hear the dulcet tones, but no breath. I dared not turn around.
I may return one day for a new generation to see. Well, you know what they say. The apple rarely falls far from the rotten tree.
It was another 3 days before Isaac woke up. The doctors said he was lucky to have not sustained any long-term damage from the pills he ingested, though he is still suffering with mild amnesia and doesn't recall much of the last few weeks. He wasn't even sure why we were in this city, and after seeing me, the first thing he asked me was, "Where's Mom?" Suffice to say, it's not going to be an easy road. I don't know what Mr. Promises is, and I don't know where he went after that deal was struck, but I never heard from him again. Nor did he show up in the house. I got my son back, and I wouldn't trade that for any knowledge on what that monster was. So I'll stick with the blessing I have. Speaking of Isaac,
The hardest thing wasn't explaining how he got to the hospital or the injuries he had. No, it was telling him that his grandma had passed away while he was asleep. He couldn't fathom where she had gone and what had happened to her. Though truth be told, I think it's best he simply thinks she's somewhere peaceful. A secret I will have to bear for the rest of my life. I just hope that Mr. Promises doesn't one day pay a visit to Isaac when he's older. As the saying goes, like father, like son. Well, I don't know about you, but I will be thinking twice before going to any kind of puppet show in the future. Which is a shame since the Dusklight Circus is coming to town soon. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of our other transmissions. We're adding them regularly and we'd love to have you as part of the Dusklight family by subscribing, hitting the bell of puppetry, and leave a comment with stories you'd love for my many-legged runners to find. It's time once again to prostrate ourselves and give special thanks to our Patreon subscribers. First, our Sturgeonite faithfuls, Haley Clark, Foe, welcome to the Faithful Conclave, Foe, Sabrina Alexander and Laree W., Purple Crayon Eater Mary Peck, our janitors Alex Nunez, Ethan Nelson, another hearty welcome to a new recruit in Ethan, Feeny Von Karma, Amy Sean, and Arkham Cookie, currently undergoing the Magenta Horror, our Void Walker Evan Diaz, currently unlocking something he calls the God Weight, and who also made an excellent broadcast suggestion for a future subscriber milestone, and one of our very own Blackwell family members, Papa Kyle Blackwell, who just challenged one Paint Gunkerson to a paint-off at the end of the winter solstice. Papa Kyle is imbued with the strength of his patron and the birth of his newborn baby, so I suspect he will have the edge on paint. Major congratulations to you and your family. A new Blackwell for the clan. We love and fear you, Papa. We thank you all humbly for your patronage and look to see you bright and early for Dusklight orientation. Purple crayons and existential dread will be provided. If you want to be a Patreon, we have a link in the description below. You'll get access to all our videos early, exclusive Sturgeon-focused D&D Monster of the Week content, and more. And one last time, listeners, close your eyes and breathe with me. Remember, no matter how bad things are, how cruel people can be, and how heavy your shoulders may feel with the weight of the world bearing down on them, Dusklight will always be here to lift the load and provide you with some respite. Drink some water, watch a video about tree frogs, eat something savory, and sleep on the cool side of the pillow with the window open and the stars twinkling down on you. Start and end each day with kindness in your heart. You matter, you are loved, and every day is another chance. I'll see you again when the sun sets and dusk enters the station.